Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode in our series on practices. John, it's good to be with you. How are you doing today?
Doing great, Brandon. It's a beautiful day.
It is. It is. I just want to remind everyone about these practices. These are fundamental practices that John and I believe should be in the life of every believer. Each practice can have varying degrees in how you might do them, but they all lead us into that deeper life that Jesus has for us. And today we're going to talk about one of the most sacred practices we have, in my opinion. It goes all the way back to the creation story. Today we're going to talk about the Sabbath. Our simple definition that most of us, when we think about the Sabbath, is just kind of a day that we might set aside for rest and restoration. But I think the idea of Sabbath is severely misunderstood and almost misunderstood to our detriment, especially in American culture today. John, can you say more about the Sabbath day and what it's all about and how it fits into God's bigger plan and in our lives as a whole?
Yeah, sure, Brandon. I think just to say, John, who's also my son, who's also on this podcast here with us, is going to give us a really good picture of one way that he and his wife have chosen to celebrate it. What I'd love to do is maybe just give you a little bit of the backdrop, because this can be a little bit unfamiliar practice to us. And I think the best place to start is to recognize our debt to our Hebrew Jewish sisters and brothers and their experience of the Sabbath. It's that this is something that they have been practicing and experts in, if you want to say that, and well rehearsed for many centuries. And for them, they root their Sabbath at this day as a holy day. It's like set aside, like when we think about how we have Christmas decorations or a Christmas tree. It's something we only use in certain times, right? It's set apart. It's not every day. And for them, this day was one day a week that was set apart to be a holy day, in this rhythm of 6 days of work and then one holy day of the Sabbath. So you can think about holy day, Brandon, like holiday. I mean, really, it's the same thing. Like when we think about a holiday, it's a holy day. It's a set aside. And so for them, like, it was like Thanksgiving for us here in America, where you have all these days where you're preparing the pies and getting the turkey ready, and then the 3 days after Thanksgiving, you're cleaning up, eating leftovers, and making turkey soup. But for them, that was like on a weekly idea of, hey, we're getting ready for the Sabbath, we're celebrating the Sabbath, and we're coming off the Sabbath. And so literally they revolved their life around this holy day. And now Christians, now get back to how this affects us, is that the early Christians were largely Jewish Christians, and so they adopted the idea of Sabbath into the reality of Easter. And so instead of the seventh day of the week being the Sabbath, they started it on the first day of the week, which was Sunday, because that's the day that Jesus rose from the dead, and a new creation, the fulfillment of that first creation story, now is taking place in Jesus Christ. So the celebration of his resurrection and the reality of that, and living into the reality of that, that's what they intended their Sundays to be all about. And so that's the rhythm that this invites us into. As Jesus followers, is every Sunday and then Sabbath, we are invited in, to break from work, but then enter into the holiday and the celebration of what it means to be God's Easter people.
Yeah. Yeah, John, just to touch on it just briefly, how important is that rhythm, this weekly rhythm of rest that God's given us? What would you say about that?
How important is it? Well, I think when I step back, a couple of things I would say, and I think the recent realities of our world and culture and the chaos of isolation and social distancing and the loss of our rhythms, the loss of routines has really made it clear people's mental health is struggling, right? And so I think God created rhythm in the world: evening, morning, sunshine, moon, day and night. He created rhythm because inside of him is itself. He is a God of rhythm, and that's why he took a Sabbath. And so we, being made in God's image, to not have a sense of rhythm, and particularly even the Sabbath rhythm as one of them, we just become chaotic. We lose our sense of who we were meant to be. And so I think it's critical for us, to find our identity, to nurture our identity. We have to have some place of rhythm in our life, and the Sabbath is a gift in that direction.
Yeah. We we see in, in the story of Genesis 1, as I've mentioned, and you've mentioned it already, where, God creates for 6 days, and on the seventh, he takes that Sabbath rest. And you've mentioned, the Hebrews were commanded to do the same, to have this rhythm. It was a part of the 10 words that they were to take this day as holy and to remember it. But what about the New Testament and us as Jesus disciples on this side? Where do we see Jesus practicing the Sabbath?
Yeah, and really good question, because we tend to look for Jesus's action and words in the Gospels as our guide for behavior, right? I mean, that's what disciples do, Brandon, right? So what happens when it doesn't say what Jesus did on the Sabbath? And so it'd be easy to think, well, it was no big deal to him. But the reality is, in his time, everybody was practicing the Sabbath. He didn't have to talk about it or correct it in many ways. I guarantee you, he participated every Friday night to Saturday night in the Jewish tradition. He rested, he replenished, he restored, he worshiped. And yet, what he does say about the Sabbath might mislead us to think about what he really believed. He often challenged the Sabbath. He was careful, right, on the Sabbath, not to work, but he wasn't too careful, right? He broke the Pharisaic regulations that they had put on the Sabbath to make it a burden. You can't heal on the Sabbath. You can't eat this or that on the Sabbath. You can only walk this many steps. And people were just burdened. He got mad at that because they were ruining the intent of God's Sabbath. And so his desire was to bring it back to its original intent. And so I think if we could watch Jesus's life, and the rhythm of his life, I would think you would find that the Sabbath was something that was a very much a holy day for him. And because it was for him, that's given me the motivation to say, I want to learn how to practice that and discover the joys and the gifts of walking in this practice along with the other ones.
Yeah. Yeah, John. Well, I mean, why don't you share that a little bit about how the Sabbath has played out in your life?
Yeah, that's good. Well, for me, I don't know, sometime about 35 years ago, Brandon, I don't know if I read a book on it, or I don't remember having any models, any people, my friends, nobody was talking about it, but somehow I stumbled on it. And when I met Carissa, we started having a couple of Sunday practices. We sang Great Is Thy Faithfulness, when we went to church together. That was something that we took on with our family for all those years growing up. When we had kids, it got more structured because now we're a family. That's a lot of times what happens. And over the years, like not all at once, but we just began to introduce different elements. For us, it was largely Sunday, and we started with Sunday school for the kids and church service. We sat together. Sometimes I would sing with my guitar in the morning before we went to church. And then the afternoon was designated to play together, which was something that I didn't get to do with the kids, for extended periods of time during the week. And that was a delight, for me. And then we would share a meal together. Usually Carissa didn't make a complicated meal, so she wouldn't have to cook. And we would often talk about our highlights. That was one of the things we did. We remembered God's gifts to us the week before. We took a look at when we have created a family shield later, we would talk about, our values as a family, where we tell storytelling, and then we would end with planning the week. I remember there was a season of time on the Sabbath where I would get the kids in my lap and I would say a blessing over them before they went to bed. We named one of our chairs the blessing chair. So didn't do all of this all those time, but I'm just giving you an idea of different things that we just settled on. We want to do those things on the Sabbath to make it a special day. And what's a real treat here, to kind of continue the story, Brandon, is to be able to introduce now my son, John, who was obviously there as a little kid, from the very beginning, and now is a young man, a father, and a husband on his own. John, welcome to our podcast officially, and I just want to give you a chance to share with us from your perception, growing up in the family, having Sabbath kind of dictated for you because you were a kid, and then you've moved out of the home, went to Seattle Pacific University, and had to wrestle with, well, what am I going to do with the Sabbath now that I'm out of the home? So tell us a little bit of your post home story.
Yeah, well, like you said, we definitely did practice the Sabbath growing up to some degree, and I think for me it was more a practice of playing and kind of pausing from the daily activities. And so when I went to college, that kind of just went out the door, in part because I was an engineering student, so had incredible amounts of work, as well as just being on the floor with 30 other guys, that's not something that was, something that we just did. And so definitely like in college, that's something that I didn't really see as being super practical.
Right. Sure, you don't have your own home, your own space, you're sharing everything. So then along comes Kalina. You meet Kalina, you guys fall in love, which is great on my end, by the way. I got a new daughter. And then you guys build a home. And then if I come over into your home, if I could show our listeners, there on your wall is your family code. One of those is the Sabbath, along with generosity and creativity. And so somewhere along the lines, you guys rediscovered this. Tell us about that journey.
Yeah, definitely. So it started really, so I graduated and I was working at Boeing, and I was working, 45 hours a week, plus commuting either way, plus dating. And I didn't really, in my mind, Sabbath kind of was like, it's kind of unrealistic. It seemed like something that was good in theory, but when it comes down to reality, doesn't. As now a grown adult, working, it didn't seem like it really would actually work. And along the way, I was actually introduced, I believe it was by Kalina, to John Mark Comer from Bridgetown Church, and he really he wrote a book called Garden City, and as well as did a number of sermons on the Sabbath. And in listening to those, we kind of rediscovered this idea of the importance of Sabbath, and primarily the idea of seeing Sabbath as an act of resistance to culture, and an act of resting and coming back to this rhythm that God created, that I know you talked about earlier.
Yeah, that's good. So tell us a little bit about the rhythms that I think John Mark in his book talked about, that you guys have developed the practice of your Sabbath around. And again, it's for those listening, it's not perfect every time, but at least this is what you're shooting for as far as your understanding. So what does a typical Sabbath day look like for John and Kalina?
Yeah. So one thing that we have found to be pretty important is the idea of marking the beginning and end of the Sabbath. And so we start our Sabbath out by sitting down and lighting 2 candles, one to remember and one to observe the Sabbath commanded in the Old Testament. And then we just read Psalm together, and it's just really simple. Doesn't take a long time, just to say, hey, right now we're starting. And then we spend 24 hours just following the rhythm of 4 things: stop, rest, delight, and worship. And so if any of the activities fall into one of those 4 categories, we deem that as being a part of our Sabbath. And so stopping, we stop the regular things that we do throughout the week. We stop working, we stop checking our emails, we stop doing homework, we stop doing those types of things. We rest. So sometimes this is physical. We sleep in, we take naps, and we rest mentally too. So we don't read really complex hard books, or we're not doing Kalina's not doing homework, or I'm not doing those types of things. And then delight. So the next thing is, we really delight in the world around us. We take walks and enjoy nature. We have really good food and drink a good bottle of wine, and just really delight in the world and then in God's creation. And then the last one is worship. So we really take time to worship God through music, through reading scripture together and out loud, and just really and journaling and praying and just sitting in the stillness and in the silence. And so usually those kind of happen in order, where the beginning of our Sabbath really starts with stopping and resting.
Sure.
And that's why we actually start our Sabbath Friday night, because it really starts us kicking off by taking time to sleep and rest. And then usually near the end of the Sabbath, Saturday day, we just really have that. We feel refreshed to be able to delight and worship well. So.
Oh, that's good. I think about, and people may not know this, part of the reason you start your Sabbath on Friday night is because you're volunteering and working at church on Sunday morning. So you've decided that you've wanted that piece of your life to not be, part of your Sabbath, which is a great reminder for those people who might work at churches, etc.
Yep.
And well, tell us a little bit about, we can kind of guess, but tell us a little bit about what have been some of the benefits for you personally, as well as maybe for one or two things for your marriage and your relationship with Kalina that have come from this.
Yeah, so we really found that by taking time to intentionally Sabbath, we just feel so much more refreshed for the week ahead. We feel so energized by just kind of being able to let go of this last week and kind of enter into this new week just with our minds set on Christ. And so it gives us space to play together and to do that worshiping together, God together, which is really helpful and important. So that's been really good for us.
Yeah, I had this image of like wearing a pair of clothes all week long, and getting mud and everything on. Then on the Sabbath, you get to take off, you get to leave behind something and then put on something to feel like you're starting something new. And that's an incredible rhythm, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And one more thing for that. Typically at the beginning, right after Sabbath, those Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, we're feeling good and feeling refreshed. And usually when it hits about Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, especially Friday, we are just, that day, we are just so exhausted and ready and excited for that Sabbath. So it has built a really good rhythm into our week.
No, that's great. Well, tell us a little bit about, maybe one of the things that tempts you to keep the Sabbath the way you want to. And one of the things that Brandon and I have both related to is that in today's world, where people are working more pressure from their employers, more options that fill our time all week long, it may just feel like to someone just feel overwhelming to think about how in the possibility would I carve out a whole day? I'm just too busy. How would you respond? Certainly you've experienced that. How would you advise people who might be feeling the struggle of busyness?
Yeah, well, you hit a real important aspect, and that is that today in our culture, there is a human condition of restlessness, and it's not how God created it. It's not good, and this restlessness is something that needs to be. God created Sabbath as like a resistance to that, and right now in our world, not only is restlessness part of the human condition, but also this idea of accomplishment and accumulation. And so what we have really tried to do is say, we want, it's important that we set aside time to resist that. And so like we have put in practices in place to say, what, we're not going to buy anything on the Sabbath. We're not going to, shop or covet something, look at like, hey, oh, how cool would it be to have this, or how cool would it be to do this remodel project on the house. And so those things have been really important in shaping the mindset behind why we do the Sabbath as well. And so and I was going to so that's kind of what I was going to say for that.
Yeah, I think, if you think about the busyness as being something that's addictive, a restlessness, even anxiety, it can be addictive. It's pushing, is that the Sabbath is part of the remedy for that. So if you can use the excuse of busyness that keeps you from it, but then the question is, do you want to stay addicted? At some point, like your recovery program, God has given us a gracious gift to re-enter us into a rhythm whereby the things that we do don't bind us in addiction.
Yeah.
And no, that's super important.
Yeah, John, I got something for you. You were
Yeah.
talking earlier when you about as you were growing up, learning the Sabbath and getting out into college and whatnot, and finding and just feeling like that it was impractical
Yeah.
for how much was going
Yeah.
on in your life. If you now, after what you've implemented and learned, could go back and talk to yourself at
Yeah.
that time, what would you advise of yourself as it related to the Sabbath? Would you continue to think that it was impractical, or would you really assert yourself to create this space?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I really would have made that effort to make this a part of my rhythm. And I think definitely in college, it probably would have looked different. And being married now, it's not just kind of what it falls into the bucket of rest, delight, stop, rest, delight, and worship. For me, it's also about us, so me and Kleina. Whereas now, back in college, it would have been like, hey, what's restful for me? What's delightful? What helps me delight in the Lord, for just me. And so that would have looked different. I probably would, a lot of the things I would have done might have fallen into that bucket. But I think that, yeah, I definitely would have made an effort to incorporate that as part of my rhythm. And definitely, like I said, it would have looked different. It might have involved more community type
Sure.
things. But yeah, definitely would have included that.
Yeah. And you mentioned a few things that you do. So I think some really simple things, but what would your advice
Mm-hmm.
be for those of us that are really experiencing busyness and, jumping
Yeah.
into a full day of holy cow, you really want me to stop all that?
Yeah.
What would be some just initial kind of first steps for someone getting started in this and being
Yep.
able to counter this, the busyness culture?
Definitely. Well, the first thing I'd say is that first thing I would say is just to start small. If you haven't done anything with the Sabbath, start by taking 5 hours of the day. Say, hey, I'm gonna for Sunday from noon to 5 p.m. I am going to Sabbath. I think it's really important that eventually you try to make that a 24 hours, because there's such a good like I said, by the end of my Sabbath, I'm able to really delight in worship. And if I don't have that, longer period of time, it's really hard to do that. But start small. I think in addition, this marking the beginning and end is really important. So marking it, and you can do that however you want. You can take a walk, you can say a quick prayer, you can start with a worship song, you can do whatever you want to start and stop it. But that is super important, because it really allows you to say, okay, you know what, for this next 24 hours, I'm going to put my phone away, and I know that it's set aside until we close Sabbath with a hymn or a song or something like that. And so yeah, I think those are, and I think the last thing I would say is that for somebody who's never experienced Sabbath and it seems super overwhelming, I have so much to get done, there's no way I could possibly do this. I think it's crazy, and there's supernatural that when you actually take time to stop, you are so much more prepared. Your body and mind and soul is so much more prepared to actually be able to complete the things you need to do in a shorter amount of time.
Yep.
And so, yes, it's like there's no way I'd be able to do everything I need to with taking the 24 hours. But you actually realize by stopping that maybe you don't need to do everything. That there's not this anxiety eating away at you that makes you feel like you need to, and it also and also supernaturally, like you just have more ability and energy and to be able to do those things well and accomplish them quickly and efficiently and well.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good, John. And just to remember the trust in God, and his economy works far differently than
Yeah.
than any of us really understand in
Yep.
that. Well, wow. I thank you so
Yeah.
much for coming on and sharing your journey with us.
Yeah, of
Uh,
course.
for either of you, is there anything else you guys have to say on the Sabbath or want to say about the practice in your life at all?
Yeah, I mean, I just say it's countercultural. Not many people do it today. and not many of your friends will be doing it. And you'll be saying, hey, no, I can't do this on that day because I'm taking a day set aside to stop. But it's going to be life-giving. It's so life-giving, and it's so worth it.
It's an addiction worth having, John, is what I say. And Chris, my wife and I, Carissa, talk about that we've actually become addicted. And maybe one little picture, Brandon, to end with is, imagine yourself, whether it's a coffee shop or it's a restaurant, some place that you're just addicted to. You love to go there for the food and the drink. I imagine Sabbath like that. I just can't imagine not going to that place. But maybe at the beginning of the Sabbath, when you have, like when you haven't been to that restaurant or been to that coffee shop, maybe the first thing you would, do to get connected is go on your Google, go on your phone, check it out and look at the menu and just order something. Right?
Yeah.
Don't feel like you have to order the whole menu, and just take a taste and then slowly allow it to get it to the place where you're familiar. You'd go in. And I think for me, the Sabbath over time is like finding that favorite restaurant. The menu, you don't have to order everything time you go, but it's something that is just life-giving, and it's part of your rhythm and it's part of your delight. And I just think that having that picture, where you're going, gives you the energy to start small, hang in there, learn, like any good sport, learning your new rhythms, your new skills, but it is so worth it.
Yeah. Thank you guys again. I hope those listening have been able to take a fresh look at the Sabbath today, something different, something bigger, the life restoring process that God wants for us in this, and the fact that he took that day in his own creation work. And so how much more would we need it in our day-to-day work? And for all of you out there, just to remember, John and I are just two disciples.
Yep, trying to find our place in God's story. Hey, John, thanks for joining us. It's been great to be together.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Bless you guys.